Imagine waking up tomorrow and discovering that overnight, while you were sleeping, something happened to your bank account. Not a glitch, not a mistake, not a lottery ticket you forgot you bought. Something real, something permanent. You open your phone, you look at the number, and your brain simply refuses to process it. Because this isn't the kind of rich that buys a yacht. This isn't the kind of rich that gets you on a Forbes list. This is something else entirely. You are now worth $1 trillion. 1 followed by 12 zeros. And in the next 60 minutes, we are going to follow exactly what happens next. To you, to the markets, to governments, to the entire global economy. Because the moment you become the world's first trillionaire, the world changes. And not everyone is going to be happy about it. Let's start with something simple. A number. Right now, the richest human being on Earth is worth somewhere between $200 and $300 billion. That number fluctuates. It rises and falls with markets, with deals, with court battles, and quarterly earnings reports. But even at its peak, that number is still less than a third of what you now have. And that gap is not just big, it is civilizationally significant. To understand why, you have to understand what $1 trillion actually looks like when you lay it out in the real world. If you spent $1 million every single day starting from the day Julius Caesar was born, you still would not have spent $1 trillion by today. If you stacked $1 trillion $1 bills on top of each other, that stack would reach 67,000 miles into space. The entire GDP of the Netherlands, one of the wealthiest countries in Europe, is around $1 trillion. You now personally hold as much wealth as an entire nation produces in an entire year. Let that land for a second. Because this is where your story begins. Not with a celebration, not with a press conference, with a phone call from your bank. The first person to find out isn't you. It's a risk analyst at a major financial institution who notices something deeply wrong with a series of algorithmic trades at 3 in the morning. And wrong isn't even the right word, because technically, everything is legal. Everything has cleared. The numbers add up. It's just that the numbers add up to something that has never existed before in human civilization. Within 6 hours, your net worth has been quietly verified by 3 separate financial forensic teams. By 7 in the morning, 4 government agencies know. By 9, it's on Bloomberg. By 10, the entire world knows your name. And here's the first thing that changes the moment that happens. Every single market on Earth flinches. Not crashes, not collapses, just flinches. Because the global financial system runs on something called confidence. On the belief that no single actor can unilaterally move the entire game board. That belief has just been challenged, publicly, permanently. And every trader, every fund manager, every central banker on the planet is now asking the same question. What is this person going to buy? Let's talk about what $1 trillion in liquid wealth actually means in practical terms. Because this is where most people's intuition completely breaks down. You have heard of hedge funds that manage hundreds of billions of dollars. You have heard of sovereign wealth funds. The giant investment arms of nation-states like Norway and Saudi Arabia that hold trillions in assets built up over decades. But those are institutional pools of capital, managed by committees, subject to boards, answerable to governments. You answer to nobody. That is the fundamental difference. That is what makes this moment unlike anything that has ever happened in the history of money. You are a single human being with more discretionary capital than the GDP of roughly 150 of the world's 200 countries. On day 1, you do something almost everyone predicts, but almost no one is prepared for. You buy something. And the thing you buy does not matter. What matters is how the market reacts to the fact that you bought it. Let's say you purchase a 5% stake in a mid-sized tech company. 5% of a company worth $40 billion is $2 billion. That's 0.2% of your total wealth. What happens next happens in milliseconds. Every quantitative trading algorithm on Earth recalibrates. Every hedge fund model updates. Because you have just telegraphed a direction. And when a person with $1 trillion points in a direction, the entire market herd wants to follow before you even get there. The stock you touched goes up 30% in 4 hours. You made $600 million on a whim. And the scariest part is that you didn't even try. By the end of your first week, something subtle has started to happen. People stop treating you like an investor. They start treating you like a force of nature. Economists call it systemic risk. The idea that a single entity has grown large enough that its decisions can destabilize markets billions depend on. You are now systemically important, and that means you are in a category previously reserved for only the largest central banks in the world: the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan. These institutions have entire departments whose only job is to monitor you as an individual. And here is where governments start to get nervous. Because the Federal Reserve can print money, the ECB can set interest rates, but you can do something none of them can easily do. You can move fast. No committee vote, no legislative session, no press conference telegraphing your intentions 48 hours before you act. You wake up, you decide, you move. $1 trillion. Moved decisively, moved quietly, moved in a single direction, can reshape an entire sector before most regulators finish their coffee. And everyone knows it. Let's escalate this, because your first week was just the warm-up. By the end of your first month, 3 things have happened. First, your wealth has already grown. Not because you did anything clever, simply because you exist. The compounding of wealth at this scale is genuinely different. Economists call it the Matthew effect. Those who have, get more. At your scale, even a 2% annual return generates $20 billion per year. That is $54 million per day, $2 million per hour, $34,000 per minute, while you sleep. Second, you have accidentally broken the housing markets in 4 cities. Not intentionally. You simply made some real estate investments. But when you deploy even a fraction of your wealth, the signal causes every major real estate fund on earth to pile in. Prices spike. Locals get priced out. Governments convene emergency sessions. You are too big for the current system. Third, and most significantly, 3 different heads of state have now called you personally, not to threaten, to negotiate. This is where things get interesting. At a certain scale, governments stop telling you what to do. They start asking you for things. This is the moment when private wealth becomes geopolitically relevant. One head of state calls because their country is dealing with a sovereign debt crisis. They need capital fast before bond markets eat them alive. The IMF is too slow, but you can move in 48 hours. You can write a check that stabilizes an entire national economy. In exchange, you want something modest, a favorable regulatory environment, infrastructure contracts, some land deals, nothing dramatic. But here is what just happened. A private individual just became the de facto creditor of a sovereign nation, and a sovereign nation just adjusted its laws based on the preferences of that private individual. In the long sweep of history, this has happened before. The Medici family, the Rothschilds, the East India Company. But that was then. This is now, and now you have $1 trillion. By the end of your first year, your wealth has grown to somewhere between $1.2 and $1.3 trillion, despite paying more taxes than any individual in human history. Despite an international coalition of governments attempting to coordinate a wealth tax on your assets. Despite 3 major antitrust investigations across 2 continents. You keep growing, and here is why. And this is the part that most people find deeply uncomfortable to think about. The rules of the current economic system were not designed for you. They were designed for a world where wealth was distributed across many actors, where no single individual could credibly threaten to move a market, where the state was always the most powerful financial entity in any room. You broke all of those assumptions. And broken assumptions mean broken rules. Not because you are doing anything illegal, but because the laws that exist were written when you were an impossible theoretical construct. You are real now, and the system has not caught up. Let's talk about what happens to capitalism itself when you exist, because this is the question that economists are starting to shout at each other in academic journals and policy conferences all over the world. The foundational premise of market capitalism is competition. The idea is that when many actors compete, prices stay fair, innovation happens, and no single entity gets to write the rules for everyone else. That premise requires rough parity, not perfect equality, but a ceiling of sorts on how much any one actor can dominate. You have now destroyed that ceiling. Here is a concrete example of why this matters. You decide you want to get into the electric vehicle market. You invest $100 billion. That is 1/10 of your wealth. A rounding error in your portfolio That single investment is larger than the entire market capitalization of most existing EV companies. It is larger than the research and development budgets of every major car manufacturer on Earth combined. In a normal market, competition works because the barrier to entry is high, but not impossible. Startups can challenge incumbents, but when a single actor can deploy $100 billion into any sector at any time, the competitive dynamics change entirely. You do not need to be smarter than your competitors. You do not need to have a better product, a better team, a better strategy. You just need to outlast them, and you will always outlast them. Because you can fund losses for decades. Because you can undercut prices until your competitors go bankrupt. Because you can hire literally every talented person in an industry. This is not the capitalism that economists theorize about in textbooks. This is something else. This is capital so concentrated that the market itself bends around it. Year 2 of your existence as the world's first trillionaire brings something nobody anticipated. Copycats, not people who have matched your wealth, but the specific convergence of technology leverage and data monopoly has been studied, and 3 of them are executing aggressive versions of it. None of them will reach your level in your lifetime, probably. But the direction of travel for global wealth is now clearly toward extreme concentration. This changes political calculations, because governments now have to think about a future where not one person holds this kind of power, but several. And several competing power centers at this scale is an entirely different problem. One you can negotiate with, one you can tax. Several create factions. Several create the possibility of financial warfare, competing for influence over the same governments. It starts to look less like capitalism. It starts to look like feudalism. Let's zoom in on you personally for a moment, because the psychology of this is worth examining. When you first reached your trillion, there was probably euphoria. The intoxication of possibility. But by year 2, something quieter has set in. Because here is the thing about having $1 trillion. You cannot spend it. You could buy every major sports franchise in North America and still have $950 billion left. You could purchase every single house in Los Angeles, every one, and barely scratch the surface. You could fund the entire United States military for over a year from your personal wealth. But none of these things makes you feel richer. Because money stops being about consumption, it becomes about power, about the ability to shape the world. And that is where things get genuinely dangerous, not because you are evil, but because power at this scale is something that even good people struggle to exercise wisely. You are making decisions that affect millions who never voted for you, never hired you, and there is no accountability structure for that. Year 3. You decide to do something genuinely good. You announce a $100 billion initiative to end global hunger. Not contribute to existing efforts. End it. Backed by your own logistics, supply chain, and satellite network. The announcement causes a complicated reaction. Governments and aid organizations are overwhelmed with gratitude. On the other hand, something uncomfortable happens very quickly because your hunger initiative comes with conditions, not malicious ones. You want accountability. You want to know the money is working. You want data. You want to be able to redirect resources based on real-time outcomes rather than waiting for annual reports from bureaucracies that move slowly. All very reasonable. But those conditions mean your people are now embedded in the food distribution systems of 43 countries. Your algorithms are deciding which villages get resources and when. Your data teams are collecting information about population movements, agricultural yields, political stability indicators across an enormous swath of the developing world. You now know things about those 43 countries that their own governments do not know. And the intelligence agencies of several major powers are now very interested in having a conversation with you. Let's talk about what happens when money becomes smarter than governments. Because this is the threshold you are approaching, and it is one of the most profound and least understood consequences of extreme wealth concentration. Governments are slow, not because the people in them are unintelligent, but because they are designed to be slow. Democratic accountability requires process, process requires time. Time means lag between problem and response. You have no such constraint. Your private intelligence operation, which assembled itself naturally around your financial interests, now has real-time data on economic conditions. Your logistics companies move goods through supply chains that thread through every continent. Your satellite network images the surface of the Earth every 4 hours. Your financial transactions give you a leading indicator of economic conditions more accurate than anything the IMF publishes. You are not a spy. You are not a government. But you have more actionable intelligence about the state of the world than most governments. And governments know it, which is why, by year 3, something extraordinary has quietly happened. You now have back-channel relationships with the intelligence services of at least 6 countries, not as a target, as a partner. Here is where we need to stop and ask a hard question. Is this a story about a villain? Because the natural narrative arc of extreme wealth is that the person at the top must be doing something wrong, must be corrupt. But the more disturbing version of this story is the one where you are perfectly well-intentioned, where you genuinely want to use your wealth to make the world better, and where the very act of deploying that wealth creates structures of dependency. Because here is the paradox. The more good you try to do with $1 trillion, the deeper your tentacles go into the systems of the world. The Hunger Initiative embeds you in agricultural policy. The clean energy investment embeds you in energy infrastructure. Every good thing you do makes you more powerful. And more powerful means more consequential. And more consequential means more unaccountable. Year 4 brings a crisis that nobody saw coming. A major geopolitical conflict erupts in a region where you have significant interests. Both sides call you, not just to ask you to protect your assets, to ask you to mediate, because you have relationships on both sides that no government currently does. You are not a president, you are not a prime minister, but you sit down at a table and 2 governments listen to you. The conflict does not end because of you, but it de-escalates, and the signal that sends to the rest of the world is seismic. Let's talk about space, because by year 5, this is where you go. Not metaphorically, literally. Your space initiative launches with a $200 billion commitment, more than NASA has spent on human spaceflight in 3 decades. Within 3 years, your company has launched more total payload into orbit than every other launch provider on Earth combined. The resources of space are, legally speaking, in a gray zone. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 says no country can claim sovereignty, but it says nothing directly about private ownership of extracted resources. You have teams of lawyers who have been preparing for this moment for 2 years. The first time your mining operation extracts platinum group metals from a near-Earth asteroid and brings them back to Earth, you will own them, and the amount of platinum group metals in a single mid-size asteroid is worth more than all the platinum ever mined in human history. Let's sit with that for a moment, because this is the point in the story where the scale of what $1 trillion unlocks stops being about money and starts being about something much more fundamental. It starts being about resources. Not money as an abstraction, not wealth as a number on a screen, but actual physical resources that the entire global economy depends on. Platinum group metals are essential components in catalytic converters, in medical devices, in electronics, in the hydrogen fuel cells that the world is betting on as a cornerstone of the clean energy transition. Right now, they are rare because they are hard to extract from the Earth. Their rarity is what makes them expensive. But if you can bring back asteroid-derived platinum in industrial quantities, you do not just make yourself richer. You crash the price of platinum. You devastate the economies of the countries where platinum is currently mined. South Africa's entire platinum mining industry becomes economically unviable overnight. You have just caused a commodity price shock that restructures multiple national economies, again, not by doing anything wrong, by doing exactly what any rational investor would do, but at a scale where the ripple effects of your rational investment decisions restructure the livelihoods of millions of people who have never heard of you. Year 6, the political backlash arrives in force, and it arrives from 2 directions simultaneously, which makes it almost impossible to address. From the left, there is a global movement arguing that your existence represents the logical endpoint of unregulated capitalism, that the concentration of this much wealth in a single individual is structurally incompatible with democracy, with human dignity. Economists who have been warning about wealth inequality for decades are on every television station saying they told us so. From the right, there is a different but equally fierce argument that your success represents the greatest triumph of free market economics in history, that the attempt by governments to regulate or tax your wealth is theft, is socialism. Governments trying to coordinate an international wealth tax find themselves caught between these 2 forces. And here is the cynical reality. Some of those governments, the ones who have borrowed from you, are not negotiating in good faith. You have become too big to tax seriously. Not legally, there is no law that prevents it, but practically. Because the implicit threat of your capital leaving is more frightening to most governments than the political cost of not taxing you. This is the moment we need to talk about what democratic accountability actually means in a world where you exist. Democracy is built on a relatively simple premise, that political power derives from the consent of the governed. But you now exercise influence over the lives of billions. You influence which sectors receive investment and which do not. You influence which technologies get developed and deployed. And you have answered to no election. Your accountability structure is your own conscience, which is not nothing, but which is also not democracy. At what scale of private power does the traditional distinction between public authority and private individuals stop making sense? Year 7. Something unexpected happens. You get sick, not terminally, but seriously enough that you spend 3 months in a private medical facility, largely disconnected from your operations. And in those 3 months, something remarkable occurs. The world does not fall apart. Your companies keep running. The Hunger Initiative continues delivering food. The space program keeps launching. And the markets, which panicked in the first week of your illness, stabilize. Because it turns out that even your trillion-dollar empire is not as dependent on any single human brain as everyone assumed. Because if your operation can run without you, then the question of what happens to your wealth when you die becomes enormously urgent, and nobody has a good answer. Let's talk about inheritance, because there is no version of your story that does not eventually arrive at this question. What happens to $1 trillion when a person dies? In the current system, wealth can be passed to heirs, donated to foundations, or claimed by governments through estate taxes. Most countries have estate taxes in some form. Some are quite aggressive. But estate taxes were designed for a world of tens of billions. The mechanisms are not designed to absorb $1 trillion cleanly. If you leave your wealth to children, you create a dynasty, a family with generational control over $1 trillion empire. Something that begins to look more like a sovereign wealth fund without a country. If you donate it to a foundation, you create an institution more powerful than most governments, run by a board you appointed. If you allow governments to tax it, the question of which governments tax it becomes the most consequential political negotiation in human history. And if you die without a clear plan, the legal battles over your estate could destabilize markets for years. Every single option changes the world. There is no neutral choice. There never was. Year 8. You are recovered, reflective, and genuinely uncertain about what to do next, because you have had time to think. Lying in that medical facility, cut off from the relentless forward motion of your empire. What has all of this actually accomplished? The Hunger Initiative has made real progress. Hundreds of millions of people have better food security. The space program has opened up possibilities that could, over the coming decades, provide humanity with resources and options that could be transformative. The clean energy investments have accelerated the transition away from fossil fuels in ways that climate scientists say will matter. These are real. But inequality globally has gotten worse during the 8 years you have existed. The concentration of wealth has accelerated. Your existence normalized a new ceiling for what one entity can hold. The governments that owe you money are less independent than they were. The democratic systems that were already strained are under greater pressure. The good you have done is real, and so is the harm. You cannot cleanly separate them. They came from the same source. They came from having too much. Let's imagine the world 50 years from now. In the most optimistic version, your era was a painful but transitional period. New international frameworks emerged, a global wealth coordination body. Your space investments led to asteroid resource extraction that genuinely expanded the total resource base available to humanity, reducing zero-sum pressure. The model of using extreme wealth for problem-solving generated enough progress that future generations regard it with complicated ambivalence. Like the industrial barons of the 19th century, deeply problematic in their methods, genuinely consequential in their outcomes. Neither heroes nor villains. Just human beings who existed at a hinge point in history and made choices whose echoes outlasted them by centuries. But there is a darker version of this story. In the darker version, your era becomes a precedent. Others followed with the same logic. In a world of digital leverage, wealth compounds faster than any regulatory framework can respond. The person with the most capital always wins. 50 years from now, the concept of the nation-state as the primary organizing unit of human civilization is under severe strain. Private entities have become more economically powerful than most states. Governments have quietly become junior partners to private interests that answer to nobody. Here is the question that sits at the center of this entire story. Is it possible to be the world's first trillionaire and also be good? Not good in the sense of personal virtue. Let's assume you have that. Let's assume you are generous and thoughtful. Is it possible to hold that much wealth and exercise it in a way that makes the world better without also making it more unequal? Economists who study wealth concentration have a disturbing answer. Probably not. Not because wealth corrupts the person who holds it, but because wealth at this scale creates structural effects independent of the intentions of the holder. When you invest, you distort markets. When you donate, you shape policy. When you exist, you signal that the ceiling is higher than they thought. And every time that ceiling rises, the floor for everyone else stays the same or gets lower. The world's first trillionaire changes everything. They prove that the systems we built to distribute power and maintain the rough balance of democratic societies were not strong enough. In a world of exponential technology and digital leverage, the gap between the extremely wealthy and everyone else does not just grow, it explodes. The genie does not go back in the bottle. The question now is not whether it is possible. It already happened. The question is what we do about it. And that question is one of the most important of the next century. Think about what you just heard. A scenario that most people file away as science fiction or a plotline for a movie. But the forces that would create a trillionaire are already operating. The concentration of wealth has been accelerating for decades. The first trillionaire may already be in the making. They may be 23 years old, sitting in an apartment somewhere, working on something small. And when that day comes, when that number appears on a screen somewhere, everything you just heard begins. The market reactions, the government calls, the geopolitical entanglement, the space race, the philosophical crisis. History suggests we will get some things right and many things wrong. The consequences will outlast every person currently alive. Maybe if we think honestly about what a world with a trillionaire looks like, we can be a little more ready. That is what happens if you become the world's first trillionaire. The more important question might be what happens to the rest of us.